Good morning. How is everybody? Good. I don't know about you, but I've been enjoying this weather that we've been having. It's amazing. I know that it's a precursor to what's to come, which I'm not enjoying, but I'm soaking it up. So I hope that you guys have had a restful week, and hopefully another restful week as we go into this week before Easter. So today we're wrapping up, as you can see. I'll be pointing back here, even though you guys will be looking here, right? Because the dual screen, which is great, but don't get confused. We'll be discussing the deeper journey, and we're really just digging into our true selves and discovering what that is, just what is the true self. And it's kind of a hot button, or not even hot button, it's kind of like a trendy thing, the true self, false self, but it's really not trendy. It's been around for as long as humanity's been alive, because we have both the true self and the false self. And so we're learning kind of how to dig deeper into a meaningful, more honest relationship with God. So last week, Aaron spoke about the false self, which was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. He discussed what that means, kind of gave us a look into what this thing is that we call the false self, which really operates behind fear. And he gave us a visualization through not only his stories, but stories that Mark Johnson told, which I thought was amazing. It was fantastic to see them both be vulnerable enough to share parts of their own story. Because I'll tell you what, it's scary enough being up here in front of people, but to get here in front of people and then tell some of the worst parts of yourself, that requires bravery, because that can be a bit terrifying. So I appreciated their honesty. I thought it was helpful. And their illustration was basically saying we all like to wear a mask, that we hide behind from time to time to protect ourselves. It's really about that. It's really about protection. And we don't really want people to know what's going on inside of our hearts and our minds because what they might think. But it's a defense mechanism. And that was one thing that I really got out of that as well, is that false self is a defense mechanism. And it's really somewhere along the lines, maybe you've been hurt, maybe you've been judged, maybe you've been embarrassed or wronged. What happens is you put up this wall, this defense, that essentially becomes a mask that hides our true self. It hides who we really are, our feelings, our pain, our hurt. And so today we're kind of talking about what happens when the false self then operates behind the mask of religion. And the title for this morning's sermon is The Idol in the Box, which I know sounds a little, the idol. Pardon me. But because of that, we'll be diving into what we call the religious false self. And the main difference between the false self and the religious false self, well, there's a few different things, but the main thing we're going to be talking about is the latter really just brings God into the mix. That's really the biggest difference. And in my opinion, this can get controlling. It can get manipulative, quite ugly sometimes. And a lot of us are nodding our heads probably because we're thinking of a certain church organization or maybe a certain person or group that operates this way, and we kind of shudder at the thought, maybe they proclaim that their God is right or you're wrong. And so the religious false self, what it happens though that we have to understand is somewhere along the lines, it actually starts with a true and real encounter with God. Oftentimes, and I think even in our false selves, it starts with a true identity that we then form. And so it starts with this genuine experience that we've had with God, right? But what happens is more often than not, if we're not careful, we then try to contain that experience. We try to replicate it, duplicate it, keep it safe, keep it nice and tidy. And so we box it up. We construct this box and we say, this is what we believe, this is why we believe what we believe, because this keeps us safe. This thing right here, it works for me. So I'm keeping it safe. And in this box, we keep it nice and tidy. This box that we box up, we then label God. And it often can really help us control what we view as God, what we proclaim as God, and oftentimes what we project to others as God. And this is a tough one because if we're really being honest with ourselves at this point, we're probably all guilty of religious false self at one point or another. It's easy to. Because if we're not careful, we can elevate our dogma, our doctrine, our theology, traditions, beliefs, and anything like that higher than our relationship with God and our relationship with others. And so that's sort of where this religious false self comes into play. It elevates over the true encounter that you have with God. And in the Bible, we read of a group of Jewish leaders that we call the Pharisees, and they're a classic example of the religious false self. Most of us are kind of like, oh yeah, I've heard of these guys. And the word Pharisee is derived from the word paros, which means to divide and separate. I thought that was so interesting. Their name alone meant to divide and separate. They were thought to be purists, they were thought to be separatists because they were separate from sin. And in the four Gospels and in the book of Acts, we kind of get a brief overview of their theology and their doctrine and their pious beliefs. And in Acts 23, we see the Pharisees, they're arguing with another group called the Sadducees. And they're basically going around and around discussing who's right, whose belief system is better. It might sound familiar in today's world. And in Acts 23, verses 7 through 8, we read, "A dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things." And so if we stop right there for a minute, it's sort of like, the Sadducees say there's no resurrection. Well, the Pharisees say this, and it's going back and forth, and it's sort of like the Catholics are in the building saying, well, we believe in purgatory, and the Baptists are like, I'll pray for you, brother. Do you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like that. Like, well, I say this, and I believe this, and I believe that. And instead of healing and wholeness, it creates division. And really, they were a group of people, if we dig in deeper to the Pharisees, oftentimes all we're taught of is that they're really prideful and arrogant. If any of us have been raised in any type of biblical tradition, we hear that, prideful, arrogant. But we dig deeper into understanding who they were. And they were people that relied heavily on their teachings and the commitment of the law. They put an emphasis on tithing. They put an emphasis on tradition and purity. And they believed in an afterlife, and the souls of the wicked would forever be detained in prison under the earth. Is this sounding familiar? And the righteous would raise from the dead and live again. Then they believed that the punishment for that afterlife was based on how you acted in this life. And so their focus, if you notice, became a shift on the external rather than the internal. It became, how do I look? How do I act? How am I being? Rather than, how am I in here? Instead of how am I doing, how am I being? And so we can see that this overshadowed their faith, completely overshadowed their faith to the point where they were so preoccupied, as that slide says, preoccupied with doing rather than being. There's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between constantly doing things and checking off the box and actually just being with God. And hopefully I won't get a few stones thrown at me for saying this, but it sounds a lot like the modern church, doesn't it? I mean, a lot. Focused on commitment of the Bible and its right teaching, an emphasis on tithing, purity. I mean, it goes on and on and on. An emphasis on separateness. We're in the world, but not of the world. And the belief in an afterlife manifested in heaven and in hell, and that how we act today determines where we'll go then, so wrapped up in pride and righteousness and doctrine and dogma that we forget being with God, and instead we're focused on doing. I read this, and I've heard of the Pharisees since I was a kid. I was practically born and raised in church, and if I haven't shared this before, my dad was a pastor. And a lot of my friends were Christian, and that was kind of the world I grew up in, and I had heard the stories of the Pharisees many times. But it was often in a way where, those Pharisees, so full of pride. And yeah, it is, but the thing that you see again and again is that it was separateness. It was division. And so I read this, and I thought, man, the resemblance is uncanny. The church I grew up in was that. To a T. Am I missing something here? That these were the very same Pharisees whom Jesus called whitewashed tombs, because really they were so blameless externally and looked perfect, but internally they were dead inside. So he calls them whitewashed tombs. And ironically, as you could imagine, the Pharisees became Jesus' worst critics, as would some of us if someone came up to us and said, hey, you're a whitewashed tomb. You're dead inside. I'd be like, oh, thanks. Catch you later. Like, I would feel that way too, right? So they became his worst critics, just bad-mouthing him. And I think if he was alive, or if they were alive today, they'd be bullying him on Facebook. You know what I'm saying? Hey, your doctrine isn't right. Hey, that's wrong. They would be giving him 1-star reviews on his Amazon book review. They would be bashing him on Twitter, #KillJesus. Do you know what I mean? It would be that kind of mindset, which we see today. And it's funny, but it's true because after all, this is exactly how the false self operates. Exactly. Classic example, we get offended, we get frustrated, we get upset, blah, we react. And I love this quote by Richard Rohr, and it just basically says, my simple rule of thumb on how to recognize the false self is whenever you take offense. Man. We get offended a lot, though, don't we? I mean, all of us. I don't think there's a single person in this room that can say, I never get offended. I'm offended by that statement. We do. And it's a good way. It's hard because it's a good way to go, wait, why am I offended? Let me take a minute. Let me take a minute and breathe and go, what's going on here? You ever talk to someone who believes differently than you? Maybe they have different faith traditions or a different outlook on life. And you get this thing welling up inside you that gets you flustered. You know what I mean? They believe one thing, you believe another. You shouldn't really care, but yet it still kind of grates on you. You're like, why do you believe that? This is what I believe. That's the religious false self rearing its ugly head. It comes up and it wants to say, I'm right, protect this God in this box. And I have experienced this multiple ways. I have been in the shoes of the religious false self, and I have been the receiving end of the religious false self. Most of us probably have. And they both feel ugly. It's not good for either the giver of that false self or the receiver. It's not good. And when I was in high school, I was in my senior art class working on one of my projects, and we had a fantastic art teacher that I still credit today for being who I am as an artist. He really challenged us to think outside the box, to think differently, to express ourselves. He taught us technique, but what he wanted more than technique was the story. He wanted you to be authentic. He didn't want you to just copy somebody else and do something else, but just be you. And so we had this project where we had to draw sort of an illustration of kind of our life and where we're at. And it's hard in one picture to draw your life. Like, what do you put down on paper? And during that time of my life, I think I was 17, and I was going through a lot. I was in this very strict legalistic church, and I was wrestling with some questions and had some doubts. I, at the same time, was wrestling with my sexuality and felt like I needed to shove that down, and there was a lot going on. So my view of God was a God that I was afraid going to send me to hell at the drop of a hat. I viewed God as a way, he was my savior and lover, but if I just did the slightest thing wrong, there I go. And so my picture that I drew was a hand coming down. So on this canvas, it was a hand coming down, a big giant hand, and I was wrapped around the finger, just barely holding on. And then there was a world in between, and then this picture of what I depicted as the devil in the bottom. And so I was just hanging on by a thread, because to me, that's how I viewed God. That God was something that you had to cling to, and if you didn't, there you go. And so I'm kind of doing my own thing. At that point, believe it or not, I was more of an introvert in high school, which is hard to believe now, but I was. Kind of kept to myself, was doodling. And there was this guy, Brian, that sat next to me that was a complete extrovert to the nth degree. Like, I mean, every introvert in the world was, terrified by him because he just was in your face. And he was weird and eccentric and different, and he leaned over and kept wanting to see what I was drawing. I'm kind of just doodling. And he says, what? And he kind of gives me this, well, explain that. What is that? And so I kind of share my view. So I, being the legalistic person that I was taught to be, explained how he could say the sinner's prayer and how Jesus saved him, and went through this whole thing. I hid my own struggles. I then put the religious false self on. These aren't really my struggles. This is Jesus saving me from hell. Brian chimes in, his weird self. He gets a paper. He draws this circle and doodles some stuff. And he said, God. I said, what? I said, what do you mean? And he goes, God is. Okay. God is. Puts his pencil down. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. No, God is this. And I rattled off the doctrine and theology I knew. That's God. No. He goes, he drew all these dots and he goes, this is us. And it was just everywhere. And then he just had a giant circle, God is. And at the time, I just remember being like, oh, that Brian, oh. I was so frustrated. And I look back and I'm like, what a wise kid. Like, whoa, what a wise kid. God is. He's all. He's in all. He's through all. He's bigger than anything we could draw on a paper, bigger than anything we can grasp. And yet we try to contain him in our little, tiny boxes. And so we like to say, oh, those Pharisees, or oh, that church, or oh, the Westboro Baptists, or oh, the such and such on the street corner. But if we're really honest with ourselves, we have to admit that we all have the potential to wear the religious false self, all of us. And it gets more interesting. See, in Matthew chapter 23, we then see that Jesus goes on to call the Pharisees hypocrites, blind, vipers, snakes. I mean, he uses some pretty strong language. And okay, they were prideful and hypocritical and arrogant, but why such a strong reaction on Jesus' part? I mean, that's a very bold, you viper. Whoa, why? And see, I think it is because the way of the Pharisees was to construct a dogmatic box that honestly it was meant to protect, and it really then became a tool to divide. The walls of the box really kept their faith neat and tidy while creating an us and them mentality. In or out, right or wrong. Their box, which I believe was originally meant to protect, it really did divide. Their religiosity really is a self-attempt at attaining holiness. And we've all been there as well. Instead of really being in a loving union with God. This really, I think this is why Jesus was so adamant against this, is because this is absolutely in the direct opposition in the way of his teaching. The complete opposite in the way of his teaching. Jesus was so far outside of that box, it was ridiculous. He was a man who died speaking a message of love, inclusion, forgiveness, honesty, until his very last breath. And so he made himself approachable to anyone, and he made his love accessible to everyone. There was no division and separation. And in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, Jesus says to the Pharisees, "But you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." And then earlier in Matthew chapter 23, verse 13, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those who enter who are trying to." Man, that's heavy. You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You won't let those who enter who are trying to. That's a hard one for me to read because I remember when I came out as gay. And at the time, I was living in a Christian bubble, a very religious false self, total Christian bubble. My parents were Christians, my friends were Christians, I was in a Christian band, I had a Christian job as a worship pastor, I was immersed in Christianity. And I too, when I came out, had the kingdom of heaven shut in my face. I had people say I can't enter. I had people say I'm not worthy to enter. And that's what we do when we adopt this religious false self. We decide who can and who can't even sometimes for ourselves. And the thing is, I learned too quickly and painfully that I was no longer in that box. I was somewhere out there. If you want to know if you're in the religious box, do something. Go get divorced. Go come out and be gay. Go be gay and divorced. You'll be like, woo, way outside that box. The damage that the religious false self can do is sometimes irreparable. And that's why it's important to discuss this. It's not a bashing of the head. I don't believe in that type of instruction where I say this is bad. It's where we know that this is irreparable sometimes, damage to ourselves and to others. It can really harm them. And I've witnessed it not only in my own life, as I just shared, but I've witnessed it in others around me. And this week, I haven't been on Facebook much for Lent, and honestly, even regardless of Lent, just for good reasons. Social media I talked about it in one of my sermons a few months ago, just kind of becoming one of those things that was not only an energy waster and a time waster, but not bringing me life. There's been lots of arguments on there that I've been seeing with people back and forth and political. And so this week I decided to hop on just to kind of see what's going on in the world of Facebook, and it's the same. It's the same. And it does a little, you're like, oh, that's cool, and then it gets old. But I decided to use it differently. Like, well, maybe this is a tool I can use. And so I decided to ask questions, because I'm a firm believer that oftentimes growth comes from asking questions of each other, of ourselves, to God. And so I asked a few questions, and one of the ones I asked was, when you hear the word religious, what do you think of, and how does it make you feel? The answers I received were the characteristics of the religious false self. Not of religion, but of the religious false self, which was interesting. It was words like angry, closed-minded, judgmental, hypocritical, brainwashed, legalistic, rules, no compassion, rigid, division, so on and so forth. I only got, I think, 2 people that said good things, like I think of art and stained glass and tradition. Everybody else, it was like, I hate religion, I hate this. I thought, wow, that is the religious false self we're showing the world. And then instead I asked, when you hear the word spiritual, what do you think of, and how does it make you feel? And the answers were starkly different. Of course, I got a few people that cracked me up that was like, I think of, tree huggers and such, which I get too. I think of hippies in Sedona. I get that. I totally do, because that includes them as well. But I starkly got different answers where it was like connection, awareness, truth-seeking, enlightenment. And I loved this, acceptance and freedom. Freedom. And then the last question I asked was, when you hear the word God, what do you think of, and how does it make you feel? And I really love that, because God is such a, you can't put God in a box, so how do you even label God? And the answers were things like beauty, safety, Father, selfless, love, and vast. Notice the stark difference between the feelings. And some of you may have had these reactions when you heard these words when I asked the questions. You may have said, oh, or maybe you don't. Maybe you have a different experience. But what if the world we lived in could be shown a faith that's connected, a faith that's aware, a faith that's inclusive, safe, loving, and free? Because that's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be free. Instead of hiding behind a faith that tears down, is judgmental, and hides behind pride. I imagine if the religious false self were a person, they would sort of be like a syrupy sweet lady from the South. Do you know what I'm talking about? The ones that are smiling and saying all the right words like darling and honey, but behind it, oh, she's got something. Do you know what I'm saying? Hey, darling. And you're like, you've got a whole other agenda. That's kind of what I picture with the religious false self. Now, I know we're a progressive church, right? So I know that I so far haven't met anyone that is exactly like that here. But honestly, I think that's because most of us are sick of the religious false self. But we still have to be careful, because what can happen if anyone knows anything about a pendulum, it can swing so far the other way, which is we then become a religious false self that says we judge those who aren't inclusive, who aren't open, who aren't science-minded, who aren't on our level, who don't think intelligently like we do, who don't study the word like we do, who don't this, that, and the other, those who are not. Fill in the blank, right? Because the thing that's really hard to understand is it can be really easy to replace legalism with a different type of legalism. Really easy. So we have to be careful, because I know that we meet people that might be so outside of our thinking, we're like, how in the world could you think that way? They do, and you let them be. And that's a lot harder than it is to actually practice, but that's what we're trying to do with this deeper journey. We also have to note that not all manifestations of the religious false self appear in negative ways, right? The examples of the Pharisees and Mary Ann in the movie Easy A, they're extremes, right? But there's other ways that the religious false self can come into play, and that's one that hides behind busyness, one that hides behind activities, spiritual retreats, Bible studies, prayer meetings, workshops. We really dive into these activities to secure our religious identity. It makes us look like we've got it all together, like we know what we're talking about, like we know who God is. And often, really more than anything, the false self is dishonest. And that's what the false self, both false selves, religious and not, it's dishonest. It's not telling the whole truth, right? It's a filtered truth, a filtered lens, leaving out the parts we don't want people to see. We often see Christian traditions that mirror this example, showcasing the joy and the happiness of faith, but then giving no mention to the very real struggles and hurts that we encounter in our lives. And it actually does more damage. It causes people to hide further into shame, to live a double life, one that quietly struggles and hurts, but the other that openly and publicly rejoices, and Jesus is in control. But sometimes it doesn't feel like Jesus is in control. But we're not allowed to say that a lot of times, because we have to keep things in a box. And I think that if we can be honest, at the heart of our false selves is the struggle for identity. That's really the problem. It's the struggle of identity. When we live as the false self, we lack a true sense of who we are. It's like we're searching for ourselves and we're projecting what we think people and God want us to see. When in reality, our true self is actually the opposite. It's the opposite of that. So how do we embark on this journey to discover the true self and true identity? I think first, we have to know, and this is a very important one, first we have to know that true self requires honesty, right? If we're going to be truthful about something, we have to be honest. So it requires honesty, and this is so important, self-love. If you want to find your true self, you have to be willing to admit who you are, first of all, which requires some vulnerability and honesty, but it also requires acceptance and love of yourself. And sometimes we're not really good at that. Oftentimes we can beat each other up and then beat ourselves up. It requires self-love. In AD 400, St. Augustine wrote, "How can you draw close to God when you are far away from your own self? Grant, Lord, that I might know myself, that I might know thee." That's powerful. That's good. Second, the true self is found in loving union with God. As it said, you cannot know God unless you know yourself, and knowing yourself begins with putting on the true self, which, like I said, isn't about being right or perfect, but it's rather about being truthful and real. There's a quote by Thomas Merton that says, "Our discovery of God is, in a way, God's discovery of us. The secret of my identity is hidden in the love and mercy of God." You want to know who you are? It's hidden in the love and mercy of God. What Merton is saying in that last sentence is basically paraphrasing right out of the Bible, Colossians 3:3, where it says your life is hidden with Christ in God. And third and last, the true self is found in loving others. And this is an important part. Remember the box that we mentioned before, right? Where you keep yourself and God separate. We live as the Pharisees. We divide and separate. Instead of a box, I want to give you a different image. Maybe that is a tunnel or a channel or a conduit. And instead, we ought to be more like that, one that lets love flow to us and through us. It's no longer about containment. It's no longer about keeping. It's about receiving and giving, receiving and giving. Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 and 39. Teacher, what is the most important commandment in the law? Jesus answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first and most important commandment. The second most important commandment is like this one, and it is, love others as much as you love yourself. Do you see this verse really is kind of just recapping all three that I just said. Love others as much as you love yourself. So first you have to start with loving yourself, and you love yourself, and you love God, and you love others. It's really all rooted in love. And then you hear the story being told again in Mark chapter 12, verses 30 and 31. And again in 1 Peter 4 and 8, we read, above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. It's really that easy, but it doesn't feel that easy sometimes. And while loving yourself, God, and others can seem like really broad statements, there's some simple ways that we can actually slowly practice this. Instead of just hearing this and going, okay, that's nice, we can slowly put this into practice. In Colossians 3, we see that Paul provides us with a foundation. And it says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has any grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Again, we see that love is the root of everything. God is love, we see that. And so Paul instructs us here, bear with one another. Another way of putting this that I think is helpful is let others be who they are. Bear with them. When you say something like, oh, bear in mind, you're saying just keep this in mind, let it be. So let people be. Or in a context of the religious false self, let others believe how they believe. Just let them. It's okay. You're God in your box. Set it free. It won't be hurt. It's okay. And in order to do this, we really have to abolish our boxes and separateness and approach each other with inclusivity, with love. Paul makes the connection yet again and again between our life and with God and our life with others. See, they're not our life here and we're separate. It's just us and God. He's saying, no, it's the whole thing. It's us and God and people. We are all together. When we love God and we love others, that is what we call a perfect union with God. And lastly, as we come to a close, I want to leave you with this final quote and encourage you to ponder your true identity. I don't want this to just get sloughed off because it's nice to hear something and go, oh, that was a good sermon, great. But I think this week as we build up to Easter, where we remember that Christ died for us, and on that cross includes our false selves. If we can kind of enter that, we can keep that in mind, then we can really meditate and pray on this throughout the week. There's a great quote by Brennan Manning that says, define yourself radically as one beloved by God. This is the true self. Every other identity is an illusion.